I want to talk about some incredibly powerful pivot table tricks. Now, I have divided these tricks into two categories. The first one are the happy tricks, things which are simple, incredibly powerful and formatting related. They're going to make you happy. And the second category of tricks are intelligent tricks, things that you do in pivot tables that make people say, how the hell did you do that? They are rare and they might also get you a promotion. Without any further ado, let's start. All right, let's just start with happy trick number one, applying filters to calculations in the values area of the pivot table. So let's just take a look at this simple pivot table that I have made, which is where I have the customer right here. There is sum of profit and there is sum of amount. And if you actually take a look at the field list of the pivot table, you're going to see that the amount and the profit have been dragged in the values area of the pivot table right here. Now, obviously, you can see that we have a filter right here, but we don't have any filters right here or right here. And I would like to be able to do that. Now, generally speaking, if you have been working with pivot tables, what people generally do is click on the filter right here and then go on to value filters and then apply the filters. But I'd like to have a more conventional looking like filter. How do I do that? So the easiest way to be able to hack the pivot table is that you step outside of the pivot table on any cell and then use the shortcut Control-Shift-L, which is the shortcut to apply filters, or you can also apply it through the menu bar in the data tab and then click on the filters, and the filters just appear right here. Incredible. And they will just work like the regular filter and you can apply the filters, things like that. In case you would like to remove the filters, you again have to step outside of the pivot table in the adjacent empty cell. Then again use the same shortcut Control-Shift-L, or using the menu bar, then you can remove the filters as well. Now, this is how you can hack the pivot table when you apply the filters here. The Excel environment generally feels that this is some data, but not a pivot table data, and that is the trick. Let's move on to happy trick number two. Happy trick number two. How do you burst a pivot table into multiple sheets and those individual sheets are also pivot tables? Quite helpful in a lot of scenarios. Let's take a look. So I've got this pivot table, and in the pivot table I've got 4 regions: east, north, south and west. And let's just say that I want to enhance my pivot table. So I'll go over to my field list, and in the field list I'll say, hey, I want to take a look at every single customer in every single region. So I have in the rows, region and the customer, and that's how my pivot table looks at the moment. For every region, how many customers and what's the sale value for every single customer. Nothing that complicated. Now let's just say that your boss comes along and he says that, hey, why don't you make a pivot table or a sheet for every single region? That means for east, I would like to build a sheet. For west, I'd like to build another sheet, so on and so forth. As many regions as there are, and I'd like to have that many number of sheets. How do you do that? Well, what you technically do is you burst a pivot table. I'll show you how. So the region at the moment is in the rows section of the pivot table. I'm actually going to move that to the values, actually the filters of the pivot table area. So I've moved it right here. And obviously you would expect that you have the filters up on the top. Once you have the filters up on the top, now you have the ability to create a page for every single value in the filters area. So how do you do that? I'm actually going to go over to the Analyze tab, and under the options, we have a drop down, and there is an option here which says Report Filter Pages. I'm just going to click right there. And this is going to tell me that, hey, do you want to make a page for every single region value? I will say yes. And please take a look at what happens as soon as I click on OK. So what you're going to see is that we're going to have 4 pages, one for east, one for north, one for south, and one for west. And these are individual pivot tables. That means that tomorrow, if the data changes, all that you have to do is come back and hit a refresh and you've got a page. At the moment, the pivot table that I made was incredibly simple, but you can have as complicated pivot table and as many pages as you would like to create. And this is incredibly helpful. Happy trick number 3. How do you sort, in fact, custom sort the values in a pivot table? This is going to be super helpful in a lot of scenarios where you don't want standard sorting features to apply, like ascending or descending. Please take a look. This is going to be helpful. So I've got this simple pivot table right here, 2 columns, region again, and the sum of the amount, which is sales. And I don't really want to show the regions in this particular order. So maybe I want to have south first, then I want to have east, and then the rest of the 2 regions. So how do you change the positions of that? Now, generally speaking, what people are going to do is people are going to kind of hover the mouse on top of this till the time you get this little cross icon right here like this, the black icon, and then you can actually move this up or move this down. So this is not a very good way of doing that. What you can do is you can actually go over to the value here, the first value, and just start typing whatever you want at the first position. So for the first position, I want south, so I'll just write S and it just gives me a prompt. Yes, south, yes. Then I would want to have, let's say, west, and I'll just write W. And then I want to have maybe north, and I'll just write N, and the last one is east. In case this is split over multiple categories, it is going to change in every single category. There is, however, one drawback with this approach. It's quick and dirty, it's very fast, it works. But let's just say that if you want this kind of scenario where you have south, west, north, and east in all the kind of pivot tables that you make in any of your Excel file, then it becomes a little hassle to do that every single time in Excel. How do you then store it into Excel and then make Excel remember this? What you'll have to do is work with custom lists. Let me show you how. So you go back over to your Excel, and in the file, you're going to go over to options, and this opens up the Excel options box. Once that box is open, I'm going to go over to advanced. And in the advanced settings, I will scroll right at the bottom of the list, which is where I can see something like edit custom list option. So if I click right here, it just gives me a little dialog box, which is where I can define my own list sequence. So you can see that here I've defined quite a few sequences. Let's just take a look at this one. So I'm going to say that, hey, I'd like to import it from the Excel sheet. So I'll just maybe perhaps click on this button. I'll say first is going to be south, west, north, and east. At the moment, these selections are coming from Excel. That means right here, and they are from the pivot table, but not necessarily these need to be from the pivot table. This is just wanting any cell to lay out the specifications of sorting, and that's about it. Once you have stored it, it will remember it. So done that, south first, then west, then north, then east. Make sure that the next time the spellings are the same. Once you do that, I'm just going to click on import. They have been stored like hard-coded right here. And that's it. I click on OK, and this is good to go. Now, the next time you build any pivot table and you would want to have that sorting that you stored in the memory of Excel in the custom sorting list, all that you do is go here in the sorting area, click on A to Z, and this sorts in the ascending order, which is already there. But if you actually click on the descending order, it sorts the other way around, which is the way that we want it. But that sorting order is now remembered across all of your Excel files, and this is incredibly helpful. My last happy trick is to selectively fill down the field values. Let me show you how. So if you take a look at the pivot table that I'm working with, we again have the region, the customer, the sales rep, and the amount. And perhaps I want to fill down the customer, but not the region. So if you actually were to pick up the standard option, that means you click anywhere inside of the pivot table, go over to the design tab. In the design tab, you have report layout, and you say that you want to repeat all the item labels. What this is going to do is this is not only going to fill down the customer column, but also the region column. But I did not want that to happen for the region, but only for the customer. Well, how do you do that? For selectively filling down only one of the columns or the fields, what you need to do is go to that particular field, right click, and then you are going to go over to field settings. Now, once you're there in field settings, a dialog box opens up, which is where you will actually go over to layout and print, and then you will say repeat the item labels. Now, if you selectively pick up that particular field and then go over to the settings of that field and then pick up this repeat item labels option, it is only going to fill this one down because that was selected and not the entire pivot table. So if you happen to click on OK, only this column gets filled and the east just remains the way it was. Awesome. Let's move over to intelligent tricks, and my first intelligent trick is that how do you separate the data in one Excel file and the pivot table in another Excel file? Especially helpful when you're working with large data and all of that data and the pivot table, if it's consuming a lot of memory, your Excel file is slowing down. This is going to incredibly help in terms of speed, but also in terms of file sizes. Take a look at how this works. We're going to use Power Pivot for that. We can also use Power Query for that, but hey, for now, we're going to use Power Pivot for that. My only assumption is that the data is spectacularly clean and you just want to lift that data off of an Excel file and push that over to a pivot table. Your Excel file is separate where your data is, and your pivot table is separate. Now, here is how it works. So I am just going to go over to Power Pivot. If you don't have Power Pivot activated, let me show that to you. So if you just go over to File, then go over to options. This opens up the Excel options box. Then go over to add-ins, and in the add-ins, scroll right at the bottom, and you're going to see something called as COM add-ins. Now I click that, I click on go, and this opens up a little dialog box, and you just have to make sure that you check Power Pivot right here. And once you do that, you're going to have Power Pivot up on the top. Now we're going to use Power Pivot to connect to an Excel file. So I'll just click on Power Pivot and I'll click on manage. Now once the Power Pivot window is open, you can see that I already have some data here, which I'm going to discuss about in the next trick. But assume that your window is completely blank and you want to load some data off of an external Excel file. So what you're going to do is go over to the Home tab, and then you'll click on from other sources, and then scroll right at the bottom to see that you have an Excel file right here. Click on next. It asks you, hey, where is your Excel file? I can click on browse, and let's just say that here is my large Excel file. It's not that large, but I just named it large. Here is my large Excel file that I'd like to import. I click on OK, and this is kind of good to go. In case your first row of the data is headers, you can also check that use the first row of the data as column headers. This is going to treat the first row as headers. You can also test the connection, click on next or a couple of times. You can also pick up the columns that you need. Let's just click on next. I can click on preview and filter. And this gives me this particular window, which is where I have two critical options. First, to choose which columns do I want. So perhaps if I don't want to have the region column, I can uncheck that, and the region column is not going to be invited. Or perhaps if I want to have only a certain customer, so maybe I can pick up the customers from here, and I can only have those customers loaded off to my Excel. So some standard ability to pick up the columns and pick up the filters is given to you by Power Pivot. And once you actually click on OK, give it a proper name, and this is going to be loaded in your Power Pivot model, just like the way that you see it on my screen. And from here, within the Power Pivot model, you can then create a pivot table onto your Excel. This is going to save you a lot of memory and also have a compact file size type. And the pivot tables is going to be relatively fast as well. All right, let's just take a look at the next intelligent trick. And this is super helpful in a lot of places. People are going to be bedazzled as to how did you pull off such a complicated calculation that otherwise seems to be kind of impossible in a regular pivot table. Please take a look. So I've got this pivot table right here, and the pivot table on one side shows the different regions, east, north, south, and west, obviously. And we have 4 years of data, 2005, 6, 7, and 8. And in the end, it shows you the latest year on year. That means it only picks up 2008 versus 7 and does the calculation for what has been the growth over 8 over 7. This pivot table is dynamic. That means tomorrow, if you remove the data for 2008 and you only have 7 and 6, this latest YOY numbers are going to update automatically. Or in case you have 2009 data, then this latest YOY data is going to be done automatically on 2008 and 2009. How did I just build that? Now this primarily is a feature of calculation groups in Power BI. In case you have worked with that, I've done a video on that. But in case you would like to understand, there is no calculation groups in Excel. How do you perform such a thing in Excel? There's a trickery to it. Let's just understand the setup that I have put together. To be able to understand the solution, we need to understand two critical parts which are driving this particular calculation. Part number one is that if you want to drag anything in the columns of the pivot table or anything in the rows of the pivot table, that item or that value should be a physical column of the data. That means if I actually take a look at the data, you're going to see that we do have the region column of the data, and that's why I was able to drag that in the rows or perhaps in the columns. Similarly, if I want to drag 2005, 6, 7, and 8 and the latest YOY in the columns of the pivot table, that also needs to be a physical column of the data. And then under this particular heading, which is the second part, I will customize the calculation that, hey, instead of showing the sales numbers, why don't you just pick up the latest years and the second latest year and then divide and then do the growth calculation. That's all about it. So this is the trickery that I am playing. Now let's just take a look at the setup that I have made. If you take a look at the current setup, I am currently in the Power Pivot window and I am working with the diagram view. And I've got 3 tables loaded right here. One is the data itself, and that is connected with the calendar or the date table through this particular column, date right here and the date right here. That's one connection. I'm sure if you have worked enough with Power BI or generally with Power Pivot with Excel, this is something that you can make it in Excel or in Power Query and load that off. Now, this is the table which is interesting. In this particular table, there is just one column, and that one column is linked with this particular column right here and this column right here. Let me actually show you what is there in this particular table. So if I actually go over to the data view, and in the data view, I go over to the all years table, you're going to see that I just have 4 values here, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and a piece of text that says latest year on year. And this, by the way, is made dynamic, and I've done some work in Power Query to be able to set it up. In case you're interested to download the file, the link is there, and all the kit and everything else is also included. You can just download the file, take a look at my piece of code as well. Now, once we have this particular table set up, you can see that in the calendar table that we have it right here, against 2005, it is actually going to find the year 2005 here, and 6 and 7 and 8. It's going to find all of the years. But what it will not find is this particular text, which is latest year on year. That is something that it will not find, and that's where we have to customize the calculation. So here is what I have done. After I build the relationships, I build a simple pivot table. I'm just going to show you the field settings for this pivot table. You're going to see that from the all years table, I took all years and I put that in the column section. And once I do that, I have 5, 6, 7, and 8. Against that, I also have latest year on year, and my data table has the column called region, and that region column is dragged right here in the rows section, against which I have written a very simple sales and growth calculation, which is like a measure. Let's just take a look at what the measure is doing. So if I right click on the measure, and if I happen to click on edit measure, this is what it shows. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly copy this particular measure and show you what this is doing. All right, on the face of it, this measure might look intimidating, but it's quite simple. So all that I'm doing is, first of all, I am checking that in this pivot table, where is the calculation working at the moment? Is it working on the year level, or is it working on the latest year on year level? That's what I am checking first of all. Then I go ahead and I calculate the latest year. That means, hey, what is the latest year? Is it 2008? Is it 2007? Which one is the latest year? Once I actually find the latest year, then I subtract 1 from that to find the year prior. Once I have these two numbers, which is the latest year and the year prior, what I do is I simply calculate the current year sales for the latest year, and I also calculate the previous year sales for the previous year. And once I have these two numbers, current year and the previous year, I'm actually going to find the growth. So if both the numbers are present, then you actually do the growth calculation, otherwise you don't do anything. And then I build that condition, which is where, hey, why don't you take a look that where are you working at the moment? If you're actually working under this particular tag, which is latest YOY, which is right here, checked right here. In that case, please show the growth calculation as a percentage. Otherwise, just show the total sales, and that's simply about it. Once you drag this calculation off to your visual, and the visual appears like this, and it's dynamic. Tomorrow, if another year of data is added, all of this is going to change automatically. Once you've understood the logic of building such nuanced calculations in Power BI, it is definitely going to stand out, and you can even customize the calculations to whatever custom need that you have. So this at the moment is latest year on year. This could be very well any of the custom calculations that you would want to build. Isn't that awesome? And not just one, many such custom calculations. The last intelligent trick is also to do with Power Pivot and DAX calculations, and it's incredibly awesome. Please take a look at a simple pivot table. I have regions here, I have years here, and I have the customer names here. My simple question that I'm trying to answer is that show me the names of the salespeople who serviced those customers in that year. Simple as that. So if on the data, if I were to apply a filter of 2004, if I were to apply a filter of East, and if I were to apply a filter for India Trotters, I would like to find out that what were the names of the salespeople. I would like to show the names here, text values here, separated by commas, that serviced that customer that year in that region. Simple as that. I don't really want to have a count. I don't want to have a sum. I don't want to have an average. I want to have an answer which is a text value. How do we do that? Let me first show to you that how the answer is going to look like. So if I actually open up the field list of the pivot table, I've already written the calculation for that, or the measure for that, and that is called all customers. If I happen to drag that in the values section of the pivot table, it appears like that. Now, if you happen to change it, so perhaps go click for MNTL. So if I click on MNTL, you can see that for 2005, Bruce was the only one who serviced MNTL in the East. And in 2005, Swati and Charlie were the two customers or two sales representatives that serviced in the region of North. This is incredible, and this obviously changes depending upon how you change the slicers or any year filters, month filters, quarter filters. Now, the interesting thing that you're waiting for is what is the calculation that is working behind this. Let me show that to you. It's a simple concatenation of the sales person's name. So if I open the field list, if I click on the all customers measure, and if I happen to click on the edit measure, the measure is like ridiculously simple. So all that I'm saying, hey, why don't you just do the concatenation of the sales rep from the data table and separate them out with a comma. That's literally it. And then once I do that, it actually presents this particular visual and I can slice and dice. Now, dragging something off to the values section and that produces a text value, that's a rare thing for people to do in pivot tables. Let me know in the comments which tricks did you find the most helpful. And in case you'd like to learn a lot more about data modeling, DAX, calculations, Power Query, data cleanup work, I'd highly recommend that you take a look at Goodly Insider, our community for learning Power BI and data.